Many people from NDOW that have made today's presentation possible. Chairman Cavilla, you did mention that this could be a long presentation. I apologize for that. This is the first time we've formally talked about moose with the commission, and I think that a lot of the information you're going to hear today is new. It's the accumulation of several years of data collection, trying to understand our moose populations, and I want to make sure that the commission is well educated on the status of our moose here in the state. I've also invited two guest speakers, Marcus Blum and Kyle Garrison from Washington. I'll do more formal introductions of those two when we get to their portions of the presentation. They'll follow me. And then I just want to take a quick minute to recognize Carrie. Carrie spent over 20 years working in the Area 7 resource and was there at the beginning when many of our moose herds started to increase. It is because of her contributions and her passion and dedication to understanding moose that we are where we are today. I think that at the beginning she was very emphatic that we dedicated resources to understanding moose. And had she not done that, it's possible that we may be behind the ball and not quite where we are at the time. So with that, just to give a quick overview of today's agenda item, I'm going to give an overview of moose here in the state. This includes ongoing support from our citizen science efforts where we've requested observations, some of the monitoring work that's been conducted to date, as well as our understanding of the overall demographics of the herd based on both that movement monitoring as well as data collection from aerial surveys. I have Marcus Blum on tap. He's a faculty member at Texas A&M. He collaborated with the department to conduct a detailed habitat analysis, and he's going to present his important findings from that work. And finally, Kyle Garrison from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is going to outline experiences from a state that has a long established moose program. As much as I want to say that I'm a long standing expert in this field, I'm relatively new in the arena, and I wanted to make sure that the commission had an opportunity to hear from somebody that has extensive experience in this realm. So a few facts that I wanted to get started out with. So moose are newcomers to North America. In fact, they were the first deer species to cross the Bering Land, or the last deer species to cross the Bering Land Bridge and come into North America. And as such, their range expansion throughout the western United States, the lower 48, has occurred almost exclusively within the last 150 years. So the post-glacial range expansion isn't yet complete, and that's what we're currently seeing in Nevada right now, is those moose are moving into the state and finding suitable habitat. Nevada is home to the Shiras subspecies, one of 3 subspecies in North America. The Shiras is the smallest in size as well as antler growth of the 3 subspecies. A gentleman by the name of Carl Bergman in the 1840s described a relationship between the environment that you live in and your body size. That is, as you move to warmer climates, species and populations tend to grow smaller. And so what we see with the Shiras species being the smallest of the 3 subspecies, that does fit well with Bergman's rule. And as you go north and you see the Alaskan subspecies, which is the largest of the 3, in Alaska and the northern provinces of Canada, those are much larger than the subspecies of moose that we have here in the state. Finally, this is maybe a trivia fact for folks. Moose have a prominent bell. It's also called a dewlap that extends below their chin. It's kind of this funny little feature that dangles down. It's a distinct feature that sets them apart from other deer species. It's believed that this extension of their chin is a visual or an olfactory cue used during the reproductive period or for reproductive behavior. There is some speculation there that there is some uncertainty about what it actually plays. And so without further ado, I just wanted to show what this thing is. As if moose aren't already lanky and awkward enough, they also, for whatever reason, through the evolutionary process, needed this long extension from their chin. And it's also important to understand that as a moose gets older, this actually becomes more elongated and grows as the animal matures as well. And as you can see on this picture to the left, cows tends to be narrower, and bulls can become or are longer and wider. So just a brief overview of the history of moose in Nevada. Our observations go back to the 1950s. However, they were really sporadic from the 1950s to the early 2000s. They occurred very infrequently. We had our first bull moose harvested near Mountain City in the early 1950s. There was a young bull moose as well as a young cow sighted in two different parts of the state in the early 90s. However, at that point in time, it indicated that moose here in the state probably have reproductive potential. And then I also wanted to highlight a report that was submitted to Greg Tanner, who was the game chief, game division administrator at the time in the mid-90s, a report detailing Nevada's only documented moose attack that occurred near Bull Camp Creek in 1996. And he titled that report, "A Little Bit of Moose Chiff." That was his name, his title, not mine, and I'm not trying to make fun of the situation. However, this is a notable event that occurred in kind of the Nevada history of moose here in the state. So these observations remained very irregular over time until about 2013, and that's when we started to see a change on the landscape, a change in the population, and they began to experience an uptick. So this figure, the cross hatches in blue, represents the distribution of all 552 observations that have been recorded by the department since 1950. It's certainly not a comprehensive overview of every single observation of moose that's ever occurred by any individual in the state, but these are ones that we've received and have been able to document. And you'll see how widely distributed they are across Elko County, as well as more recent expansion into the Ruby Mountains south of I-80. And we continue to see one or two show up around north of Winnemucca and on the south end of the Santa Rosa Range in Humboldt County. This figure to the right, where we have the year on the x-axis as well as the number of observations on the y, shows that growth in observations over time. And again, 2013 seems to be a change. I would speculate that at that point we met some minimum number in the state that facilitated more successful production events. That those number of observations have increased since that time, and then this last year we experienced a significant spike. One point that I did want to make on these observations is one, a single observation can represent multiple moose, as well as multiple moose may have been observed multiple times by different parties, and we received that observation. So there's a bit of pseudo-replication going on. And then also back in 2013, that's about the same time that I got my first smartphone. So I do think that there is a correlation between technology and what people have in their pocket and their ability to get those observations quickly to us and to not have them kind of gather dust and fall by the wayside. So we expected observations to continue to increase. However, 2023, this recent calendar year, we saw a increase of over 300% from our annual average of the previous 5 years of about 57 observations. This is likely in part to increasing prevalence of moose in the state. However, in the fall of 2023, we strategically targeted hunters that were hunting in Elko County in October, which coincides with the moose rut. We sent them emails. We had targeted social media campaigns, making them aware of the above QR code, which you can use with your phone right now to go straight to our observation form and log a sighting. As much as I like to self-promote this endeavor because of how successful it was, this was done out of necessity because of staff shortages in our Eastern Region offices. In fact, I remember vividly Scott calling me one day saying, "What the heck are we going to do about all these observations? I can't keep up with them." And this was our solution to do that. So this is a short animation. I really hope that it works. But what this animation is going to show is the change in those observations over time starting in 2000. So I have about 25 years of observations. This animation is going to take about 45 seconds. I'll try and walk you through as it goes. It does go relatively quickly. So again, the crosshatches represent sightings that are seen. We're moving through time, early 2000s. You'll see singular observations being reported, many near the Idaho border. As we get closer to more contemporary times, you'll see those observations begin to increase. And about 5 years ago is when those numbers took a significant jump. And more recently in 2023, this is the last year, you can see how many observations we received and where they were within the state. So as moose began expanding across the state, we wanted to gain a deeper understanding of their demographics as well as their movements. So like all biologists do, we want to get our hands on these animals. We initiated our first capture in 2020, where we caught 4 moose. 2 were in the Deadline Ridge area of northeast Nevada, and the other 2 were on Elk Mountain. Both of these were adult females. So from 2020 to the present, we've caught a total of 9 adult females and 4 adult males, so a grand total of 13 moose, and those came from areas 6, 7, and 8. They're well distributed across Elko County. The objectives of these monitoring efforts was to understand survival and production, space use patterns, as well as resource selection of our moose herd. Adult survival using a Kaplan-Meier survival analysis, we determined that average adult survival over the 4 years of the study, so for annual survival, was 98%. An adult to survive all 4 years of the study would be 92%. And that's January 20 to January 2024. We had 1 lone cow mortality that occurred during parturition in 2023. What I'd like to point out, I did a fairly comprehensive review of adult survival and juvenile recruitment for moose. I found 1 reference to a stable to slightly increasing moose population that came from Montana with an annual adult survival of about 87 to 90% and a calf ratio from surveys of 40 calves per 100 cows. Since moose are relatively long-lived, high adult survival can compensate for low productivity. We confirmed that 14 calves were recruited into our adult population, so they survived to at least 1 year, and we assume that they've reached sexual maturity, but that was through summer 22. And then also, we had a staggered entry of females for this monitoring project. So in year 1, we had 4 cows. We added an additional 2 cows in year 2 and 1 in year 3. And so if you think about how those calves are broken down over the year, that's actually a really impressive number for an ungulate species. And then we also kind of highlighting individual heterogeneity and how some moms might be better than others. We had 1 cow that produced twins over multiple years. Twins is a sign of a highly productive moose population, and we've seen many females that were unmarked also bearing twins and seemingly successfully recruiting those into our herd, statewide herd. So the figure here is going to depict our 2023 analysis of utilization distribution of all 13 radio collared moose. I've aggregated these utilization distributions into a single distribution layer just so that you can see where our radio collared moose occurred in relation to the observations that were reported in 2023. Again, those observations being the blue crosshatches. This model was informed by 36,000 GPX fixes over the last 4 years. We noted very minimal interstate movements, which that has been, it has been speculated that much of the Nevada moose population are just transient individuals that move down to Nevada during certain times of the year. We have no evidence to support that from our monitoring efforts. We did note that bulls travel longer distances, which is pretty typical in ungulate populations, so that did influence the size of the home range. You can see one long distribution that roughly runs from the eastern portion of the Jarbidge down to the Stake Mountains. That was a bull that moved back and forth between those areas. I did want to point out that 68% of our reported observations in 2023 were outside of this boundary, the home range boundary that I've outlined here in orange. And further, only one of our public observations was of a radio-collared moose in 2023. And I don't want to get too into the weeds about mark recapture analysis, but citing already marked individuals is kind of an important element of coming up with population sizes. The more individuals of a marked population that you cite, the likelihood that the sample you collected is closer to the true population. The fewer individuals that you've recited that have been marked tends to be a broader population than what you may have expected. Some of the common habitat associations that we've seen in our moose, despite speculation or despite the reputation that Nevada is a very dry and arid state and a lot of our observations come from very open rangeland, these moose are correlated or associated very commonly with dense aspen stands, like you'll see here at the right, these riparian zones in the lower left of this figure, as well as mountain conifer habitat types where you have sagebrush, mountain mahogany, and spread out conifer. Dr. Blum's going to talk about habitat use in more detail in the next portion of this presentation, so I will jump on from this. And then finally, just a brief overview of our survey results and population estimate. In 2023, we observed 55 unique moose from the survey, so we went through all of our observations on flights and determined that there were 55 unique individuals that did not get recounted. 84% of those encounters occurred during surveys that actually weren't intended for moose. They were during deer and elk flights. We did implement a dedicated moose flight in February 2023 with mixed success. Despite their large size, their coloration, they're really difficult to find from the aircraft because they're antisocial and they have a propensity for thick cover. But only recently, a count of 55 individuals kind of helps us provide greater insight into the overall population demographics. So our resulting bull and calf ratios here was 110 bulls per 100 cows and 55 calves per 100 cows. And I just want to reference back to that study by Montana, where 87 to 90% adult survival is good for a stable population, as well as 40 calves per 100 cows, a stable to slightly growing population. And then here to the right is our modeled population estimate, going back to 2003 with the year on the x-axis, and on the y is our population estimate. And again, we did start to see growth around 2012, but I would say in 2018, or roughly the time that I took over this position, the population really started to expand. So in summary, while our increased observations don't correlate or do not predict moose abundance in the state, they're reflective of a growing and expanding population without a doubt. Our adult survival and calf recruitment values are well above those that are published in the literature, or well above minimum thresholds just required for population maintenance, a stable and not growing population. So we believe that our population is growing rapidly, and it began around 2018. So our evidence right now appears that Nevada moose are in this quote-unquote Goldilocks status, where we have both high adult survival that's necessary to carry a population through tough times, as well as really strong production. All of this information together suggests that we're in a population eruption right now. And from what has been experienced in other states, this eruption is not likely to be sustainable. Moose have a propensity to live well outside of their means, and at times you can quickly overshoot what the habitat capacity may be to support individuals. So with that, I just want to acknowledge several funding contributors for the project, the monitoring work, our analyses, of course, the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Fund, our Heritage Program. The Houston Safari Club has donated radio collars for future deployment, as well as Texas A&M and the Natural Resource Institute there, and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife for graciously donating Kyle for his presentation coming up. In the interest of saving time, I can introduce Marcus unless there's a burning desire to go through questions now, or we can hold those until the three of us have finished up.
I think let's do the questions at the end.
Okay.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, Marcus, let me introduce you. Your presentation isn't showing up here on the screen yet.
Yeah, I'm gonna let me know if this works. That work? Is it popping up yet or not? I'm sorry, I can't hear anything.
Not quite. While we're waiting to get set up, Marcus, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. So Marcus is a research scientist in the Natural Resource Institute at Texas A&M University. Previously, he spent 10 years in Nevada working with mule deer migrations and finished his PhD studying various aspects of bighorn sheep ecology. His work currently focuses primarily on large mammal ecology and management, with an emphasis on movement, resource selection, and population ecology. And despite his extensive background in bighorn sheep, I won't hold it against him. So with that, Marcus, you can jump in.
Thanks, Cody. Is my screen available? You can actually see the presentation now.
Yeah, you're good, Marcus.
Okay, excellent. Cody, thanks for that introduction. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge all of the NDOW contributors here. Cody, Carrie, Travis, and Scott. They were instrumental. We had several meetings before we conducted all these analyses, and their information kind of helped guide me to where I would focus on the habitat analyses, and also a collaborator here at Texas A&M, Dr. Stephen Webb. With that, let's jump in. So moose are widely distributed across the northern portions of North America. However, these populations have been significantly declining in various portions of this range for a variety of reasons, including habitat loss, increasing ambient temperatures, heavy tick loads, etc. That said, we're seeing some interesting expansions across the lower 48, including north central New Mexico and obviously northeastern Nevada. So these are areas that do not have a history of moose occurrence, and seem to be opposite of where we would expect moose expansion given their ecology. So moose are cold adapted species. There's well documented thermal limitations. So the literature is documented that moose may show heat stress in summer months at high temperatures greater than 68 degrees Fahrenheit, although that number is up for debate in various publications. But other environmental factors such as wind, shade presence, behavioral adjustments, all come into play when thermal stress is observed. So those temperatures have been, the debate with those temperatures is mostly because, well, they were recorded in closed environments where animals couldn't make behavioral adjustments and seek shade or seek water to cool off more. But as we're all aware, Nevada is not necessarily known for its cool weather. And while Nevada is not at the southernmost portion of the range, it may certainly be at the furthest thermal limit for the species, which makes the recent expansions into Nevada, or relatively recent, all the more interesting. So these populations are likely dispersing from southern Idaho, where moose use a wide range of habitats, including mixed aspen and conifer forests in the southeastern portion, and riparian, cottonwood, and willows in southern Idaho. While some of the habitat types in southeastern Idaho are similar to those found in northeastern Nevada, it is imperative that we actually understand how individuals are utilizing habitat in Nevada to determine how many moose Nevada can sustain, as well as aid in future habitat management projects directed at helping this new species population to grow. So given we have so little information on this recently colonizing population, we set out to gain a bit more information regarding their habitat selection tendencies. So the Department of Wildlife hired me to look at four main things here. So first is we're looking at the number of days in which moose may show behavioral responses based on that 68 degrees Fahrenheit commonly reported in the literature in Elko County. Also to identify the environmental covariates that are important for habitat selection of moose in Nevada. And they want us to delineate a probabilistic map of suitable habitat across Elko County, and then use the probabilistic maps and NDOW population estimates to calculate how many moose Elko County could potentially support. So what we did is we did a resource selection function, and so here we've got all of the moose locations from past collared individuals, males and females. Different colors represent different individuals, and then we have like a 20-kilometer buffer around all of these locations, and so that's like defining this available area that will conduct a resource selection. And so what these analyses are doing is essentially it's taking these true locations of from moose, and we're tying habitat attributes to them, and then we're going to generate a ton of random locations all across this available blue surface, and we're going to compare the used locations to the random locations, and it's going to then tell us whether they're avoiding or selecting specific habitat types relative to their availability on the landscape. From there, we can take that, we can predict all across Elko County where the best habitat is and where the lowest quality habitat is. And we can also use some methods from Boyce and McDonald 1999, where we use current population estimates and that habitat selection. And basically, we're estimating how many moose can be sustained in each habitat type, and then projecting the total moose in the area. So that's pretty sensitive to the NDOW estimates. And right now, as Cody said, they're still probably growing. So these may be a minimal estimate, those numbers I present here in a little bit. So we broke all of our data into a couple seasons. Here in blue, we have our winter. Green is going to be spring. Orange is going to be autumn, and red is going to be summer. And this is based on a climograph in the Wild Horse weather station. And so we're just using precipitation and temperature data to show which seasons and what the climate is, where the climate is most similar, where the moose are, and then breaking it up and running seasonal resource selection functions. So as far as what we found, as far as days in these areas, we have like 10 weather stations over here I'm presenting data on here. It's a lot of numbers, but for the most part, we're looking at over 150 days for the most part of days that are over that supposed thermal threshold in Nevada. It ranges from about 38% to 49% of the year is over the thermal threshold. Again, there's behavioral adjustments individuals can make, and that thermal threshold isn't necessarily hard science in the literature, but it is something we can at least reference. And then we predicted this until 2050 based on climate change projections, and we're looking at probably about 2 additional weeks of temperatures over that thermal threshold in the future. So as far as some of our resource selection results, to walk you through how this is going to go, I'll have the habitat covariate in the top left for each side. And then you have what we call the coefficients on our y-axis, and that's just if they're above 0, that means they're selecting 4. If it's below 0, that means they're avoiding that habitat type. Then on the x-axis, we'll have autumn, winter, spring, summer. It will always be in that same order. Circles will indicate female habitat selection. Triangles will indicate male habitat selection. And then these bars are just 95% confidence interval. So it's that range we can expect that habitat selection to fall in. If confidence intervals overlap each other or zero, that means there's no significant difference between them. So what we're seeing here for elevation, males in triangles are always selecting higher elevations than females. What this would project out to is probably in the 7,000 to 8,000 foot range. But females are always selecting lower elevations than males. And in winter, females are actually avoiding those. They're selecting slightly less than what we would expect, or slightly less than what's available elevation. So they're probably selecting more of that 6,000 foot range. And that makes sense, right? Because there's going to be a lot of snow accumulation and they're not going to be up in those higher elevations. Move to distance to water. And again, I'm only going to focus on the really important variables. We ran some others, but for sake of time, I'm just going to focus on a couple of these. Distance to water here. What we're showing, distance to water actually, if it's below zero, and this is the only variable that matters for, but this is actually selection for areas closer to. It's just how that number works. Since it's a distance to variable. And so what we're showing here is males and females are always selecting for areas closer to water, which makes sense, except during the autumn where males are selecting slightly further from. And that's probably because these males are moving and breeding, searching for females, so they're moving away from areas at a higher frequency. Conifer cover. Both males and females are always avoiding conifer cover. Not super strong, other than in summer with males. We still see some sexual segregation here, where males and females are separated. We're not seeing overlaps in the confidence interval. So females are typically selecting slightly less conifer, avoiding it slightly less than males are. As far as grassland, we see a pretty distinct difference here, and of all the variables, this was the most distinct. Females are typically selecting higher amounts of grass cover, and males are typically avoiding areas with lots of grass. We go to mountain mahogany. We expected this to be really strong in the winter, but it seems that males and females are selecting for areas with greater mountain mahogany cover across all seasons, which is impressive. Males and females strongly overlap there in the winter, but we still see that difference where they're selecting different intensities of it. Females typically selecting higher percentages of mountain mahogany cover than males. We go to our riparian woodland. This was our strongest and most important variable. Males and females are both selecting for high amounts of riparian woodland cover. So this is those aspen stands, willows, things like that. These riparian corridors are extremely important for moose habitat selection. Males select them to a higher degree than females in all instances except for during the winter. But again, in all seasons, we are seeing a strong selection for these areas for lots of riparian cover. And then when we go to shrubland, we're seeing a little bit of a mixed bag, but so shrubland's going to be more of your sagebrush and your mountain brush species. And we're seeing avoidance of these areas during autumn. And females are avoiding them across all seasons, whereas males are selecting for areas with higher shrub cover during winter and spring. Now, on to our predictions. So now what we're showing here is we take all these habitat selection results and we predict all across Nevada, right? So what we're going to show here is it's Elko County. On the left will always be female. On the right will always be male. And so this is autumn, to remind you that time period. That's October. So what we're estimating here is, as far as quality habitat, is about 482 square kilometers of quality habitat based on our resource selection analyses for females, and then 540 square kilometers of quality habitat for males. our population estimates using NDOW's population estimate and our resource selection is saying we could hold approximately 101 females during October and 101 males during October based on the habitat available. Oh, sorry. And green is going to indicate really high quality habitat, and that white is going to indicate poor quality habitat. So green to yellow is basically going to be what we're saying is quality habitat within Elko County. From November to March, we're seeing significantly less habitat available. So this is just our winter period. We're saying there's only 0.32 square kilometers in Elko County and only 1 square kilometer for males, 0.32 for females. But based on our estimates, we're saying that, there's still, NDOW is estimating around over 100 individuals in the area. So we're still saying based on this amount of habitat and those population numbers, we can sustain 96 individuals to 119. These aren't pure numbers. Again, there's some variations highly dependent upon the NDOW numbers that are presented. Also with this, we're thinking there's like a lack of data here, or it's not as strong. That might be why or there's a lot of movement going around, and maybe that's why we're not really keying into really strong selection on some of these resources. For April, May, that's our spring seasons. Females, we're going to see about 370 kilometers squared of quality habitat, and for males, we're going to see about 820 square kilometers of habitat, with an estimated potential population size of 97 versus 106. We can see there's a lot more quality available habitat here, estimated based on our spring resource selection functions. And then in the summer, we're seeing for females about 340 square kilometers versus 0.02 square kilometers for males, with an estimate of at least 91 to females and 99 males. So in conclusion, as far as our what we're looking for with estimates of climate change, potentially 2 weeks of increase of 2 weeks in days greater than 68 degrees Fahrenheit. We're showing strong sexual selection in moose across Elko County, which is what we'd expect. This is a species that sexually segregates throughout most of the year. Pretty similar habitat to other nearby populations. They're selecting areas close to water and using those riparian corridors heavily. This is likely a thermal refuge as well as high quality nutrition in the area. They're also selecting mountain mahogany, which I think is really important from a management standpoint, and avoiding those real thick conifer stands. Appears to be a decent amount of habitat autumn, spring, and summer months. Winter habitat appears to be lacking, but that needs further investigation. This could just be a lack of sample size. These are low sample sizes, although they represent a high proportion of the population, still relatively low for some of the infants. And then males tend to have more habitat availability in all seasons except for summer, and that's limited by 4 males in this analysis versus like 9 females. And with that, I would like to thank Nevada Department of Wildlife for bringing us on, trusting us with this. My agency, Texas A&M Natural Resource Institute, and I believe I think we're moving on to the next. Right, Cody?
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. Do we have Kyle on, Linda? Is there any way we can turn the volume up on this TV? Oh, okay. Oh. So my next invited speaker is Kyle Garrison. And Kyle is the ungulate section manager for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he and his team work on a variety of management strategies for mountain goats, bighorn sheep, moose, deer, elk, and pronghorn antelope. And he's stationed in Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's headquarters in Olympia. I would say I met Kyle about a year ago, and I don't know if I've ever met somebody that's as knowledgeable as well as articulate with the various topics that he's familiar with. And so I look forward to having Kyle here to talk a little bit about how they've been doing things in Washington for quite a while.
Good morning. Thanks, Cody. I appreciate that. I'll try to live up to those expectations. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. All right. Are you seeing a full screen view of my presentation?
Yep, we're good, Kyle.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and jump right in. Again, thanks for bringing me here to give you an overview of Washington State's moose management. It's a real pleasure to be here. So the content of my overview today is pretty brief. We'll just give a quick species overview. We heard most of what we needed to from Cody. And then I'll dive into my agency's monitoring program on moose, our harvest management program, and offer just a few closing thoughts on how we do things in Washington and how we got here. Okay, so like Nevada, Washington's moose are known as Shiras moose or Shiras moose. You hear it kind of said both ways. This subspecies occupies the western mountainous areas of the contiguous United States and southern Canada. You can see that on the top right there in brown. That's just one illustration of the Shiras moose distribution, and then other subspecies of moose in the more northern areas of North America. The figure on the bottom right is a model breeding distribution of moose in Washington. That figure is actually fairly dated, but it's useful to kind of show us where we have moose here in this state. So our core range is in northeastern Washington there in the top right in that gray, really larger gray area. That's where we find most of our moose, and that's where moose had naturally recolonized sometime mid, maybe 3/4 of the way through the 20th century. I'll speak more to that here in a little while. We also have a population that's well established in north central Washington. That's that other gray blob you see there in the top center. What this is missing is probably an established but small population in southeastern Washington in our Blum Mountains. And we also have moose that have, we've documented similar dispersal events to what you folks are experiencing in Nevada, where we've had moose go down from that north central population, move down the Cascade Crest. That's kind of that wiggly little line where all those counties meet there in the sort of left third of the state. And if you go about halfway down there, that's Mount Rainier National Park. And in late 2022, we had the first documented reporting of an observation of a moose in Rainier National Park. So that's pretty exciting, especially for me as someone who lives on the west side of Washington. We don't get a lot of moose over here in headquarters. We also have moose that have started to expand out of that northeastern part of the state around the city of Spokane, so it's sort of east central. And we're having those moose move out into the high desert of the Columbia Basin. So this is more of the land, like the landscapes you see in Nevada, probably sagebrush steppe, more open. And that's over the last 5 or 6 years, we've really started to see more and more moose out in that area. Our moose population, as I mentioned a little bit, has gone from basically zero in the mid 20th century to growing to exceeding probably 5,000 animals in 2016. That was the last time we've done a really comprehensive population estimate, and that was restricted only to the northeast part of the state. So adding on all those other animals, we had probably in excess of 5,000 animals statewide in 2016. Okay, so the statewide goals for us in Washington for moose are to preserve, protect, perpetuate, and manage moose in their habitats to ensure healthy, productive populations. Number 2 is to manage moose for a variety of recreational, educational, and aesthetic purposes, including hunting, scientific study, cultural and ceremonial uses by indigenous peoples, wildlife viewing, and photography, and to manage statewide moose populations for a sustained yield. And I did go ahead and peek at a little bit of what NDOW has for some of their mission statements and goals, and this probably looks a little familiar for some of the things that you folks are using as your guideposts. So for us to meet these goals, we rely on monitoring, and our biologists use a suite of data sources to monitor moose populations and their status and their trends. Like most ungulates in Washington, we primarily rely on aerial surveys and harvest data to monitor moose. Our aerial surveys varied in methodology quite a bit over the last several decades, but generally these are giving us an estimate of demographic composition, which is then usually presented as an age or a sex ratio. So Cody showed you some of those. We use the same kind of ratios. Those give us the standardized metric to compare through time for a single population or across and among different populations. So those age or sex ratios can give us an idea of how productive the population is being, whether or not we're recruiting calves into the population, and how many animals are available for harvest in ensuing seasons. One of the primary limitations of our aerial surveys are detectability in this densely forested area in northeastern Washington in particular, but other areas where we find moose as well. So that's illustrated in the photo in the top right. That's the Selkirk Range. That is an aerial survey for moose, and we're flying around looking for them. And you can imagine that that's a somewhat challenging situation, as Cody spoke to. These are somewhat solitary animals. They're not really gregarious. They're not in big groups like elk. So it's a real challenge to get out there and get a good count of moose. Another issue related to detectability is the presence or absence of snowpack. So that's shown here in the bottom right photo. So you can clearly make out there's two moose, and that's great. We got that observation. But had there been no snow on that background, or maybe patchier snow, we've now got darkly colored animals on a dark background with shade. That's a real limitation, and it really impedes the detectability of those animals, and has increasingly become a bigger problem with shifting climatic patterns. So beyond composition ratios, we also use aerial surveys to estimate density and abundance. This is less frequently though. So these methods might be like mark resite or distance sampling. You heard Cody talk a little bit about mark recapture. Mark resite is just a different version of that. These surveys have a more intensive protocol and requirements, and that can really increase your costs above just a standard composition survey. So for example, mark resite, as we heard Cody mention, you need animals out there on a landscape that are already marked. Typically, that's with a radio collar or a GPS collar. So now that necessitates you having captured those animals before your surveys, and that comes at a cost. So with these types of data, you're paying for that precision. You're paying for a higher quality of data. We attempt to aerial survey our hunted moose populations as often as our funding and the weather and the environmental conditions allow. And that averages about every 3 or so years in the last 6 years, especially due to both the snowpack complications I mentioned, and we were also grounded for quite a long time under the early years of the COVID pandemic. We also use harvest data to get information on the population. So harvest reporting is mandatory in Washington, and these data provide us information like the age at harvest. We have the hunter pull a tooth, we get a tooth, we age that tooth at a laboratory. We get information on the antlers, or at least historically we relied more on that. That tells you something about the maturity level of the bull moose that are being harvested. We don't rely on the antler piece as much anymore. We also, though, importantly get success rates, hunter effort data, how many days you're spending in the field. And that success rate, all else being equal, can tell you something about the availability of animals on the landscape. And is that going up or is it going down? We also employ the use of radio collars, and we heard a lot about how we can use those from both Cody and Dr. Blum, Marcus Blum. And so I won't cover that much, but we do use radio collars, and we historically have quantified things like survival and movement. And we use those data to help us not only inform our harvest management, but also just to then optimize our aerial survey techniques. Okay, so jump into harvest. So in Washington, moose hunting has always been a limited entry system. That means, of course, that you have to apply for and then be awarded that permit. That's opposed to other systems we have in Washington for deer and elk, where it's largely an over-the-counter opportunity. If you're eligible, you can go in and purchase a license and get a transport tag. We offer moose permits in several categories that specify the legal animal. Typically, this is for bulls, but we do also allow some antlerless take. And so those are split up into different categories. We also use those categories to spread opportunity among user groups. So like youth or senior or disabled hunters have special categories for just those specific types of hunters. And that helps, create a little bit better equity for those folks that might otherwise be washed out in the competition for these fairly scarce number of permits. If you draw a bull moose or draw a permit where a bull moose is an eligible animal, that's a once in a lifetime opportunity. So good luck, because you're never going to be able to go out there again in Washington. If you draw a cow permit, you can do that multiple times in your lifetime, but it's just really up to the odds of being that successful in drawing those permits. We also offer, in addition to these special permits for the everyday type of hunter, there's one auction permit, and then there are 3 raffle permits for that include moose as an eligible species. And we use these primarily to generate revenue for our monitoring program. So those revenue, that revenue funds our survey flights. I'll show you our harvest trends and some of those stats here on the next couple of slides, but I wanted to mention that we do have some harvest guidelines that we use. These aren't exclusive. We use other information, and these have been augmented and built on, but these sort of serve as the bedrock of how we think about our harvest structure for moose in Washington. So we implemented these in the late 90s. And these rely on the demographic composition estimates that we spoke of and you heard Cody talk about, as well as the age of a harvested bull in our harvest statistics. So, for example, here you can look at the table here at the bottom. If you've got a high relative number of bulls to cows, or a high relative number of calves to cows, or you have a high age of harvested, median age in this instance of harvested bulls, indicating you got a lot of mature bulls on the landscape. Hunters aren't having any issues finding these more mature bulls with larger antlers. You could probably afford to liberalize your harvest levels by, say, increasing permit levels. Of course, vice versa, or you may decide, hey, we're sitting pretty good. We like where we're at right there in the center, and we keep ourselves where we are and just keep monitoring our statistics. Okay. So hunting began in 1977. We issued 3 permits. This figure shows our permit history and the harvest history going to 2005. I'll show you the rest of the data on the next slide. In 1977, again, 3 permits issued. These were for bull moose. In 1972, our Department of Game at the time, it was called, reports that there was at least 60 animals in the GMU where we hunted these, where we issued these permits. So 5 more years of growth. I can't find a good estimate for where we were in 1977. But you can see we kept it pretty conservative for a long time, at least a decade or so before we started kind of turning that dial, feeling like we had the moose to support more harvest. So you can see that the permits are going up. Those are in the markers with a circle, whereas harvest is the marker with the square. One of the things I'll point out there is that you see those 2 lines are tracking really well together. That just means we had pretty high success. In fact, success rate in this period of time, I went back and looked, it's 92%. So that's pretty great. And that's kind of should be expected for something like this where there's really limited entry, not a lot of other hunters you're competing with. During this period from 77 to 2005, we harvested a little under 750 animals. And again, that primarily being bull moose. So now we start here, 2006, same essential layout here. Number of permits are in circles. The squares are the animals that we've harvested. It goes to 2022, which is the year of our most recent harvest statistics that we have available. We don't have 2023's data yet. So you can see, again, the number of animals harvested tracking really well with permits. We're having pretty high success moving through time. 2014 to 2016, we had this large-scale population estimation effort in the Northeast core range of moose in Washington, indicating, hey, we've got a fairly large population here. It can support, even maybe a little bit more harvest. They turned permits up there, where we peaked in 2016 at 170 total permits. And then we had a real bad winter. 16-17 winter was rough on all of our ungulates. We started to see some changes, some metrics that indicate, hey, maybe we actually hit the peak of our population growing in that northeast corner, and maybe we're stabilizing, even seeing some modest decline. And at that point, we started to pull our permits down a little bit. And you can see that harvest has gone a little bit lower too, meaning our success rates went down, maybe indicating, in part, at least, a lack of availability in the landscape relative to past. Although in this total era 06 to 2022, success averaged 90%, but since 2016, it's been averaging just under 84 or 85%. It's 84 or so percent in that period. We harvested a little under 2,000 moose, so over, I think it was 1,945 or so moose during this period. Okay, so that's kind of all I have. That was a bit of a fast and furious overview of how we do things in Washington and the history of how we've done things in Washington. So just some closing thoughts. I think the moose management story in Washington is a success, and I think it's a great story for the North American model. I think it's a great story for wildlife conservation, and it's one I'm really appreciative of. That my predecessors put us in a good place, and we have a growing and a healthy population of moose in Washington. I think the keys to success, again, mostly my predecessors doing this because I haven't been in my position actually for very long. First, not said here, of course, you got to have moose show up and do well, or you got to bring moose. Well, Nevada's already got that, and moose showed up in Washington just like they did in Nevada, and so we're good there. And then we obviously had to have the habitat for a population to grow and be successful. Now, beyond that, again, in our management goals, we have a population that seems established, it seems to be doing well and exhibiting growth. We want to issue a harvest on a sustained yield that's enough to take advantage of that sustained yield, but still promote stability or growth, depending which of those are your objectives. I think routine monitoring can't be understated and how important that was for us in Washington in managing this population, and using multiple sources of data, like I've talked about. And we probably even use even more sources of data than I covered here today. I also want to plug investments in emerging and new methods. You heard about some really exciting research and some habitat research and trying to make really empirical, data-informed choices in the preceding talks. I think that's really great. I think it's where we have to go. And I spoke a little bit about how we struggle with detection. Our surveys are almost getting a little outdated based on the environmental conditions we seem to be meeting in mid to late winter. And so we're investing into even more new methods and trying to optimize our survey techniques. So if you're curious about that, we're actually initiating a moose monitoring project, deploying radio collars here in February. And so if you scan that QR code, you can read a blog post that I think just came out yesterday. So it's right off the press. That QR code is present on this page as well. And I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Kyle. I want to just acknowledge both Marcus and Kyle really quick before we move on to questions. They felt like they did a great job on their presentations, and I also appreciate them taking the time out of their duties, their standard 9 to 5s to present today and help provide Nevada with a more detailed understanding of moose, our moose, as well as how they're being managed elsewhere.